overall teachers are remarkable people. They really are. Like, people who come into education and stay in education are, genuinely speaking, wonderful people who genuinely care about the development of the children that they're working with. So for me, sort of those inspiring environments, and I think a similar quality is almost to a very good principle, is that fundamentally they see their role as shepherding a community, right? Building a community of learners.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. My guest today is Dr. Pius Ryan, Superintendent of Schools for the North Vancouver School District, a leader who has spent his career building clarity, compassion, and systems thinking to move education forward in British Columbia. Trained as a high school teacher, Dr. Ryan brings both an intellectual and emotional depth to his work. He's not just a policy thinker or district manager, he's someone who sees education as a living system, one that requires stewardship, intentional leadership, and most of all, trust. Over the years, he's led efforts to reimagine student services, launch Canada's first school-based welcome center for newcomer families, and served as president of BC CASE, supporting professional growth and senior education leaders across the province. What stood out to me about Pius isn't just the breadth of his leadership experience, it's the care with which he talks about the work. He believes in healthy schools and healthy communities, in school structures where the complexity isn't something to be avoided, but embraced, and in leadership that's reflective, principled, and patient enough to listen. In our conversation, we talk about his early teaching years, the mentors who helped shape him, and his transition from psychologist in training to systems leader. We explore how he thinks about district governance and the superintendent's role in shaping culture, not just strategy. He shares his views on equity, early childhood learning, and what it means to lead schools that are both academically rigorous and emotionally safe. We also discuss the changing social contract between schools and society, the growing pressures on the education system, education for human flourishing, a topic we'll revisit on future podcasts, and the mindset required to lead through ambiguity without losing sight of core values. This is a conversation for anyone who believes school systems can be both rigorous and humane, structured and adaptive, and for anyone that knows strong leadership begins with a strong sense of purpose. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Pius Ryan. Pius Ryan, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
Good morning, Jason. Actually, I'm on the beautiful territories of ancestral territories of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people on the North Shore of British Columbia, Canada. This is beautiful North Vancouver, and it's actually a nice day. It's not raining, and we have a bit of an inversion over our port where the clouds are all socked in. But it's a good day.
Well, I do tell everyone that will listen that on a sunny day, the Lower Mainland, Vancouver area is the most beautiful place on earth. So
it's
I'm
pretty
envious.
Remarkable for sure on a nice day with a good view for sure.
So Pius, I would have given you a proper intro at this stage, but can you give the audience a sense of what keeps you busy professionally these days?
Oh, thanks, Jason. Well, right now, of course, I'm the superintendent of schools in North Vancouver. So, really, that's a role in working with the Board of Education and trying to shepherd what we would have as a vision of what good schools look like and quality education. And of course, there's lots of layers to that when you have a complex and a diverse community. We're situated in the North Vancouver area, in the Metro Vancouver overall, and it's we're I would say a middle class to upper middle class community. So there's lots of investment, one might say, in the public schooling enterprise here. But we're also very diverse with regards to student diversity and the changing environment, certainly with immigration. So my day-to-day is pretty full. We have 17,000 students. We have certainly I think a really focused educational vision through the goals in our community. So it's Yeah, I think it's a constant shepherding of that while running a complex organization with all of the things that happen within that organization.
Well, I definitely want to dive into the details of the role and the complexities of the role, but I always want to start the audience with a more personal touch. I want them to get a sense of who the humans are behind the administration. So, if you don't mind a brief detour into your background, can you describe where and when you grew up?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm very fortunate. I grew up on the very east coast of Canada. So I was born in Newfoundland and actually was born in Labrador, but Lab City, but then grew up on the east coast. It was, an interesting time and a place to grow up. So, I was in high school in the early 80s. And so my family would be considered the first generation out of the Bay. And so in Newfoundland, that kind of means something. Both my parents are from this little village called St. Vincent's in St. Mary's Bay. A beautiful place, but if you ever want to see whales, that's where people go. But culturally, they were the first generation to move away from that way of living and move to the east end of St. John's. And so I grew up with what I would feel is like a foot in each camp, right? I was one way a townie, and then another part of me was a Bayman. So one of my best friends was my cousin who lived in St. Vincent's. And so I spent a lot of time in both environments. So it gave me a very unique perspective on changing dynamics too. Because it was also at the time when the outports were starting to really die because the inshore fishery was closed in the later 80s. And so, yeah, it was a fascinating time to grow up, but great freedom. A great place to be from and to become my first steps. And then I came out to British Columbia when I was probably 24, 25. And so most of my professional career has been here in BC. But,
So you spent your childhood in Labrador. Can you describe?
Well, in St. John's, yeah.
Oh, in St. John's.
Yeah,
Newfoundland.
okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you describe what it was like as a child? Like maybe paint the picture for us as what a day looked like. How did you play? How did you mingle with friends?
Well, if I think about back then at that time, one thing that we had that seems to be, excuse me, less right now is the freedom. Right. So growing up, there wasn't as much organized activities for children, right? And I think that may have been a broader Canadian experience at the time, with the exception of the outdoors in Newfoundland. Like you were constantly, if you weren't, playing with friends in your neighborhood, you were out in the woods or out in the bog or the marsh, and you had such autonomy. Like helicopter parenting couldn't even be conceived by my parents or my friends' parents. And so that was probably the most vivid thing I feel from that time, was that sense of freedom, but also the autonomy that came with that freedom and all the things you learned about yourself and others by having that freedom, right? That'd be just a massive difference from what I see right now, certainly in North Vancouver, with the way children's lives are scheduled and routinized, and almost, the competitive nature of growing up versus growing up. So yeah, that's what I remember most, for sure.
What aspects of your education, early education, stand out to you?
That's an interesting question. Early education, again, I go back to almost like the feeling or the spirit of what that was like. And for me, and I reflect on it from then into now, there wasn't a sense of urgency about education. And what I mean by that is you went to school, it was part of your life. There wasn't this expectation of achievement in the same way. Of course, your parents wanted you to do well, and I'd get the obligatory lecture that I could always do better. But however, right, that's
you and me both, my friend.
Yeah. However, I actually believe I became increasingly educated throughout my life because I didn't have that sense of this must occur for you. So I don't know if it was just for me or that. I do feel like that was more of the zeitgeist of that time, and that there wasn't as much pressure that you have to become educated. And I think with that, you had the freedom to actually, ironically, become educated, because you could flow into paths that were more intriguing for you. Yeah, so that's probably what I remember the most.
Do you recall one of the things or a few of the things that you first loved to learn? Anything that captured your imagination at a young age?
This is the funny thing about learning, right? And why it's always a risk to routinize things so drastically. I have a vivid memory of sitting in the back of a class in high school, and I wasn't really doing what I wasn't really paying attention to much stuff in high school, and particularly this class. And I looked up on the shelf, and there was this magazine. So I pulled down the magazine, and it was a condensed version of Othello by Shakespeare. And every class I'd go in, I'd pull that down and start reading it. And that became striking to me in regards to how it engaged me, not my classwork, but the fact that material was there. And then I remember after that reading, I wasn't much of a reader, to be honest. I was really a busy kid. But I remember reading the book Moonfleet. And for whatever reason, by Faulkner, it captured my imagination and the idea that there were other ways to look at life. Anyway, that I remember being poignant and staying with me, and probably transitioned into a number of things down the road. But really striking how funny those moments are.
Yeah, and almost how random they seem in hindsight, right?
As they
finding
say, right?
Othello, I couldn't think of, maybe a few other Shakespearean plays, but what a great one to just, occupy your mind with instead of listening to the teacher.
Yeah, truly. And I always think of that notion that, life can only be understood in reverse.
Live forward, but understood in reverse.
Yeah,
beautiful,
yeah. And so,
beautiful thought.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing.
What did you study that impacted how you think the most?
That's interesting. I've been fortunate. I've had a very varied career, right? I started as a teacher. I moved into school psychology. Then I went, that was at UBC, and then I went and did a doctorate in educational studies at UBC. So my first two degrees were at Memorial University of Newfoundland, English and education, and then moved to UBC after that. Well, I worked in between. And the reason I share that because if I think about how I think about work right now, they were, of course, influenced by every part of that, but probably two or three really big things. In my master's in school psychology, of course, is psychometrics and that kind of stuff. But a big part of school psychology is about what are the ends, right? If you understand the ends, and then you do an assessment to determine where are people towards the ends. But that concept of what are the ends really stuck with me. And then, in doing that work, you'd help an individual student or teacher, right, make a difference. And I was always struck by, so if we can do that for one, what's the power if we systematize or systematically implement things across groups of teachers? So I got drawn more into that systems and how do you make an impact as a system. But then the other side was when I did my doctorate work, there were really two things that, again, had macro influence, right? One was Aristotle's notion of what is knowledge, right? So this notion of Episteme, Techne, and Phronesis. Episteme being, of course, academic knowledge, Techne being hands sort of work, and Phronesis being practical wisdom. Now, so again, for me, that influenced So there are different ways to teach for different ways of looking at knowledge. So that was pretty powerful. But probably the most powerful thing out of all of that was this simple notion of what makes a good life. Right? And so I'm not sure to the degree to which we pause in the tyranny of the time we're in to consider what makes a good life. And really, when we look at our education system and what we ask others to do, teachers, et cetera, how are we really considering that in influencing how we look at what curriculum, what's the design, what's the intent, what's even the structure of schooling? So I know that's a pretty complicated answer in some ways.
No,
but
I'm ready to throw out all my questions and dig right into that one.
There's all these forces, right, that lean into how we see or don't see the work of public schooling.
I didn't really say that tongue in cheek. That is really one of the backbones or central themes, so to speak, of the podcast that I increasingly want to explore.
Right.
Because I think that question of what makes a good life is central to the narrative of education. And I don't know if it's just me. I don't think it is. But I think as a whole, society, the media, amongst teachers, we've lost the script a bit as to what the purpose of education is. And I think a lot of where we go wrong collectively is because of that. So let's circle back to that question of what makes a good life.
Sure.
How do we start to answer that in the educational context? I don't know how many teachers and just teachers as a reflection of the population in general ask themselves that question. So how would we start to consider it in the education context?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a societal as well as education. There's just been an old adage that education cannot cure society because there's so many forces around it. I think, a jaded side would say there's an advantage to certain factions to keep everybody so busy that we don't stop and think about this stuff, right? But we have created, in some respects, our own beast around tyranny of urgent, right? If you think about, personally, as I look at urbanization as a whole, as a method of organizing human beings, and that becomes increasingly the narrative that we need to build bigger and more and condense, I'm not sure that adds value overall to the human flourishing or human existence, right? So you create environments where there's constant tyranny of the urgent. Like I was referring earlier to parents sort of on North Vancouver, for example, and I'm one of them, right? So when my children were younger, there could be days on a Saturday where we would have 7 different events to go to, right? So in that, when is there the time to pause and think, hey, how am I doing? What is this? Is this the life that I believe is of most value in regards to that stuff? So I think there's a lot of challenges just simply by the constant sense of doing versus hang on now. Let's pause and ask ourselves some questions. I do think it's very much time for certainly provincial, but I would go federal and even bigger. And I know some of these conversations are happening, but how do we bring them more to light? That there's a need to talk about what is the role and purpose of our education systems from a macro level. What are we trying to achieve? And we've been locked into, in every province, when you look at their mandate for public schooling, it's very much written from an individualist perspective, right? Like we're doing this so you as an individual can get X, Y, and Z, right? Intellectual development, human social development, career development, but it's about you in some respects, right? And there's always that, and I mean, that's also pretty much the North American story, right, in some respects, right? That individual accomplishment. But now, and that may have been fine, right, 50 years ago. But we're now in an age where we know, right, it's the Anthropocene age. We're in an age where our human way of living currently is impacting the Earth's systems, right? Like literally we're endangering our planet. And people have varying degrees with that. But or positions on it, I guess. That being said, it begs the question, what's that balance between individualism versus a we, right?
Well,
and so pulling back the lens.
It's really interesting that you bring up that ecological view in connection to a greater narrative within education. I've been rereading Neil Postman's End of Education, and he actually identifies exactly that as one of the great themes or thematic structures to build the, raison d'être the education. And I find that fascinating.
My experience with people has been, when you can have a real conversation about what their hopes and dreams are for their children, right? Many people want them to, of course, lead a good life, right? And what is happiness? Okay, there's varying things with that. But I would say, something I've really been intrigued with, I guess, as a way forward. I think there's other ways to build a broader conversation, but to think of the human being, what's a fundamental trait of a human being? We know ourselves through relationship, right? So this notion of being in relationship. And usually people live better when they have healthy relationships, right? So let's take that understanding of how are we as human beings in relationship, right? And I would say there's certainly from my lens, 3 macro level forces that we should be talking about as a species, really, right? And I know that's pretty grandiose, but one is, of course, and part of this work is our relationship with modern technology, right? So artificial intelligence, generative technologies, and synthetic biology. Like, what is our relationship as human beings within that, and what should it be? Not waiting for it to happen to us, but to have some agency with that. Of course, the probably the real most pertinent one is our relationship with the earth, right? Not just individually, but collectively. But we know that in the time we're in, like I take recycling as an example. It's great if I recycle, or I should say it's good if I recycle, but it's great if everybody recycles. Like there's certain fundamentals that as a species we need to be monitoring. And the last theme for me would be our relationship with self and other. Right. So what do I mean by that? Would be take urbanization and all of the busyness in the world right now. What tools do I have as a human being to pause and consider, how am I doing? And what do I need to be, right, in the city of, or wherever I may be? Because there are tools and skills to learn with that. And then how are we with each other? How do we see each other? Right. So that notion of diversity, as we, again, in a world that's becoming globalized and urbanized, how we contemplate others and see each other's in diversity and appreciate that, I think is increasingly important. But it also needs to be shepherded. And I think public schooling, ideally, like certainly in Canada, is the foundational place where that way of looking at the world, so I wonder, right, if we look at those 3 relationships, and then we were to look at our curriculum, right? And then we were to look at, so what influence would those things have on everything we do, but yet with a shared end or a vision of health, right? Healthy relationships. Anyway, that's some of the stuff that's been on my mind, and how do we get educators at a classroom level, considering as they're working through their instructional design, taking their curriculum and deconstructing and reconstructing, how are those ideas finding place, right, in the management of the social environment, self and other, in the tools that are used by children and by educators that that allow them to go deeper on certain issues that may be infused with technology, to, of course, how are we looking at thinking about our individual and collective relationship with the earth?
Well, you've highlighted a few things there that I want to double click on and go deeper into. And maybe we can do that through one of the other themes of the podcast that ask the question about what is Canadian education, because the world seems to think, and I think rightly so, that Canadian education has got something special happening to it. I would propose, although we don't have a federal body of education, that we actually do quite well in those areas. And the fact that you are insisting we keep going further in those, when it comes to identity, multiculturalism, community, living together, and sort of, enhancing how we live together, it has been a sub-theme, although not clearly identified within Canada, as to what we do really well. So I guess where I'd like to take this is, can you, on the one hand, give us some examples of classrooms or teachers or principals, whatever comes to mind, as to what you've seen and that's inspiring that we do really well? And then the follow-up to that is, what do you want to do as a system leader to enhance that idea of human flourishing by questioning how we are to live?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at, I think this is back to also, with parents as well. Overall teachers are remarkable people. They really are. Like, people who come into education and stay in education are, genuinely speaking, wonderful people who genuinely care about the development of the children that they're working with. So for me, sort of those inspiring environments, and I think a similar quality is almost to a very good principle, is that fundamentally they see their role as shepherding a community, right? Building a community of learners, right? They really do. And then those that really excel are those that do that, but also are deeply invested in being pros. Like, they want to know, if it's their subject area, they want to know everything about it and ways to, like, they're not complacent. They are locked in. And the same with really good school principals. I think, it's funny, I listened to something around climate change, and someone would contend, it was a TED Talk, and they contended that, the number one thing we could do about climate change is talk about climate change. Like, just keep the narrative alive, right? So I'm inspirited by this notion that we're having this conversation, and I'm pretty sure that, if I'm thinking these things, clearly other people are thinking these things too, right? And so it's a matter of, part of this is just what you're doing, right? Is spreading this possibility of thinking. And I think as a system leader, of course, part of my role is to ensure we have good systems and structures and people are supported, and, that the system itself is running well, so that there's space, which is challenging because the margins in public schooling are pretty slim when it comes to monies, et cetera. But we take care of that part. But then it is actually getting people to think about these things. I go back to teachers being professionals, right? They really are, in their learning environments. The power of an idea is an amazing thing, right? So I see my role, certainly with every opportunity, to reinforce with clarity these prevailing areas of focus, right? So number one, what kind of education for what kind of world, right? What is a good life? And then, okay, so these three core relationships, right? Modern technology with the earth and with self and other. If that's true, how should we, or what should we be considering in our stewardship of our classroom or our schools, right? And in our discipline areas, for example. In my experience, I think I'm a pretty typical person in that way. If I hear something that really resonates and I go, you know what? Yeah. And I'm committed to my learners. I really believe that that's, right now, that's a significant part of the path forward, right? And sharing that across our country. I do think there's a place for a little bit more of a federal. I'm always scared about that because, you get the petty politics involved sometimes. But Canada, I think, has always been joined together, that we've had lots of space in this country We haven't had to fight over resources, right? We're seen as good. And I think the fundamental narrative of Canadian education is creating good people. I'm not sure, and I can't speak to province by province, our clarity around the ends in mind, right? There certainly is a spirit to being Canadian, but I think maybe we can potentially forward a few more pieces to that are less, in some respects, less esoteric, right? More defining as a country. Here are some of the priorities we see for the citizens of this country and the citizens of the world, right? Because that's the bigger part of this picture, is that we can certainly control and work on local events. However, if we go back to our collective behaviors impacting the Earth's systems, and we are more interconnected than ever, there's some work to be done. Right? I hope that's giving you an answer there, Jason.
Yeah, it's a wonderful answer. It's one that leads to more questions and reflections, the best kind.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if you'd want to get into some of the curriculum out in BC that really, I think, is leading the way for Canada. But in particular, I'd like to connect the new curriculum to this ecological view that you're espousing, because I think BC is done in a really unique and meaningful way, and that's through also incorporating the identities of the Indigenous peoples, because the Indigenous peoples have this wonderful connection, and I think connection in the right way, this ecological way of viewing the universe that kind of merges these two ideas together. And I think this is also something that is happening across provinces, but maybe just in a slightly different way, newer way in BC. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I've been in sort of senior roles a long time. Probably started 2001. I think I'm actually the longest serving member of our provincial superintendents association. Again, different roles, but I've only been a superintendent for 3 years. This is my third year. So I only say that because I've watched the evolution, right? Where Indigenous, growing up in maybe this is a story I can tell, but growing up in Newfoundland, I remember, I shared this with a colleague of mine, Brad Baker, who's in charge of Indigenous education here. I remember loving, in grade 6, we used to have this series called The Voyageurs. And I remember studying the Haida people, and I'm like an anthropologist, sociologist at a core, right? I love this stuff, and I was drawn to it, but it was almost a story of the past. And so coming to BC, and being a Newfoundlander, you have your traditions and cultures. I was always curious, what are those traditions and cultures in BC? I used to joke with my wife, because she's from BC, that name one song from BC. Well, Newfoundlanders had a bunch of songs. However, I was always struck, why didn't BC lean more into their Indigenous history? Because it's such a beautiful, the people. But then, of course, then you start to learn about the actual history of our country, and it's quite, devastating. Anyway, so I've seen the shift and rise in that work, and I think BC has done a lot of wonderful work there. And I would agree with you in that the Indigenous perspective of sense of place and belonging, certainly in North Vancouver, that has had a profound impact on how we think about our community, right? So yes, I think it has been a catalyst in that way. I would say, though, as a province, we need to go a lot further, right, when it comes to our relationship with and our focus on our relationship with the earth. And I'm not saying we become, too extreme on, against oil and gas and all that stuff. I think it's more of a real appreciation of, do we understand, for example, what are circular economies versus consumption-based economies? Get our kids thinking about meaningful, not just recycling, but repurposing, and or when we're using materials that, like, I guess this is in some respects an old idea, use every part of that material, and then that material comes back into our economy in a different way. That type of thinking I think we could do more, right? I think we could do more in building that that critical thinking exercise with that regard. And I think we could do more as a country in that regard, and of course as a planet. Because we can't see. Sorry.
No, you can finish that. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yes. So as you described that, Pius, I have this vision for a while now as where schools necessarily have to go in order to get to this future of informed, real informed citizenry that participates actively in democracy. And I've had this vision of schools being the locale for this kind of change. But the schools still today, although it's changing, but are by and large based on an entire structure that was convenient for a growing working class, right? Where information was scarce and you had to go to central locations to get the information. But the vision I have is more of the schools being a locale for this exploration, for this way of considering new projects, being almost on the ground level of new projects. And I know a lot of educators such as yourself won't disagree with that. But what does it take to make that kind of change?
Yeah,
transition might be the better term, by the way, not change, but a transition.
I really appreciate that. One of the things I was really drawn to as I moved through my career was this concept of school development, right? In that, think global, act local, but how do you truly support a school in its development as a community and as, in some respects, stewards of broader community, right? Because every school in our community links to the next school, which links to the playgrounds, which links to the weekend soccer games kind of notion, and parents standing along the sidelines. So I love that notion. And we've done a lot of work in this school district to talk about and to bring people together. Like our school planning process, for example, is very much a community planning process. We bring schools together in a family of schools. And what we call dinner and dialogues or focus sessions where diverse teams, including students and parents and teachers and principals, et cetera, come together to talk about, right, what makes a good school and where are they on the journey. So from a structural vehicle, we have that in place. That being said, and of course, what I'm sharing with you is I would love, of course, for them to be contemplating, where are we with these things, right? What are we doing to teach social emotional skills and connection with others? What are we doing around environmental understandings, et cetera? What are we doing around using technology? So I think that's certainly the place where it has to happen. Some of the things that make it challenging are, as you said, right, that we have structures that are ensconced in, for good or for bad, in collective agreements and in legislation that limit our ability to be creative. They were brought in, I think, like some of the class size and composition stuff that we have. Again, some of that's certainly good to protect, right? Because workers, you can get misguided management, right? So I totally understand it. But it came from a time when that was, in fact, the case, right? People were not treated as they should be treated. My mom, for example, as a teacher, had 53 children in one of her classes, right? And, but that was a different time and a different place. And she was super proud. They all learned to read. She was good at that. She's a proud Newfoundlander. But however, I do think some of those things get in the way, right? And some argue the 8x5 timetable at secondary, that we live by a bell still. Yeah. It's kind of, and the segmentation of disciplines. There's a place to segment learning from disciplines so people learn foundations. But then there's a place to bring the disciplines together, because the problems we have are not so discrete, right? And we really don't learn that until we get into the workplace in some respects. So I do think that that's a tricky one, right? Because it's such a complicated thing as a large system as a whole, say across British Columbia. What are some baby steps you can take that create freedom, but yet maintain rigor, autonomy, but yet clarity of focus for schools and personnel within schools to come together and talk about these things. And I said to you at the beginning, like, I have full faith in teachers and educators. As you know, there's always individuals that may have different, potentially misguided perspectives, but most people, they genuinely want what's best for. And if we create a space and time, it will influence how they think and act, right? So yeah, there's work to be done. Let me
come at that work from a different way. Maybe as you hinted earlier, let's take the end in mind first. So sure. Let me pose the question to you this way: what can we do to best equip students for a rapidly changing world?
Well, I think mindset is super important. Mindset and agency are things we, and again, there's a developmental nature of growing up too, right? Students are ready for things at certain times. I think we're doing a lot better job at collaborative learning and students taking ownership, you could say, for their own learning overall. But when I think about that, so I'll go back to what I said about relationships. I think fundamentally, as human beings, we have to understand what it means to be a human being, right? And how we create health for ourselves and others, right? The only person's behavior we can control is our own. I get that, and more people need to understand that they are responsible for themselves. But with that, right, if we help young people see themselves in relationship with, and take the three themes I propose, right? Modern technology, the earth, self, and other, right? If that's true, and you're responsible for your own behavior, this notion of equipping you and or you seeking how to have healthy relationships with these entities, these themes, I believe that's, in effect, you are equipping them. You are equipping them for whatever will come down the road. Because if they see it as a relationship, and relationships are always developing, right? I think the mindset, and of course, with that, the inherent agency that breeds, that's what I think about that.
And is that the conduit or the view through which you want them to look at the role technology should play in their lives, and maybe more broadly in teaching and learning?
Yes. Yes. I mean, and again, as we know, we have different quality of relationships at different stages of our development, right? So I think technology or modern technology, there's always been technology, and by modern technology, of course, we're referring to AI, generative technologies, again, the understanding of synthetic biology, et cetera. I see those things as being, number one, if we're clear on the ends in mind, in other words, what's a good life and what are the relationships we need, right, to bolster a good life individually and collectively, right, then it's natural to start thinking about, okay, so where does technology fit in that developmental process of young people to be supportive of these relationships, as opposed to technology shows up and we're using it all different ways, back to intentionality, right? And again, I know initially when anything first starts, there's a flurry of activity that may be more about the tools than about the ends in mind, right? That's okay, but I do think people, I wouldn't say go slow to go fast, because technology, or at least it's beyond us in some respects, but there does have to be a reckoning with some of it. I give you an example. Of course, as you know, in many jurisdictions, digital devices have been restricted in school settings. And part of that's because, the book Rewiring of Childhood, since 2012, social media and gaming has outpaced our ability to set appropriate guidelines and rules in place, right? When cars came in, we had many years before they were a popular technology. So we had roads and rules and lights and all that stuff.
But you can still argue that we didn't do a good job with the cars, given the congestion of every city on Earth. But yeah, I take your point.
Now, well, I know what you mean. I think we allowed cars to then become versus more thoughtful.
This is actually right on to the conversations that we don't understand early enough the environment, the new environment that the technology is going to create. So with the car, it created the suburbs, and
Correct.
cities weren't organized around the car, and that's why no cities can handle the amount of cars to service all of the suburbs, and that still need to get in. The people still need to get into the city. And so when I look at something like AI, I guess the question for someone in your chair is, how do you see the environment that's creating, and how are you preparing students to navigate that environment? I should say teachers too, because it's a whole new environment for them as well.
Yeah, you absolutely, I think that's a great way of framing it, right? And it's very true. And so that's why for me, right, it's so important to take a step back and a step up, right? So it's that old notion, you can't see the terrain when you're sitting in the forest, right? You have to find a higher peak and look down. For me, that's going back to our trying to, again, promote that conversation and understanding of what is a good life in the modern context, right? And we have these massive pressures as a species. And, we can go into all of that stuff about migration, climate change. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can compartmentalize it, and here are the macro themes. But if we're challenging those things, then I do think the lens as to where technology, whether we clarify that as simply generative technologies or AI and generative technology, I think we start to see more clearly, where should that be located? Because with you, as you stated, like, the speed with which we saw sort of the handheld device and the related tools overtook in a heartbeat what our appreciation of what childhood should look like and parameters around that. So if we don't try it, and again, we know it's going to continue moving. I do think there's always a balance of activities when it comes to it. Number one, we do need to educate educators on what are we talking about, right? And we also need to give exemplars of what is its influence on current influence on child development, right? The old, I'm sure of course you've heard, children speaking rudely coming into kindergarten because they're used to talking to Siri. So they say, Siri, where's my X? As opposed to using...
I haven't heard this.
Haven't heard that?
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is sort of this evolutionary kind of aspect of technology that it actually adjusts our behavior because of, right?
Oh, that I understand, but I didn't realize, and it makes sense that toddlers, and then as they go into kindergarten, are used to demanding answers from from Siri, and then treating their kindergarten teachers like that.
Yeah. So there I go back to the understanding, and that's evolving, and educators need to, I think, hear those anecdotes and understand, because I think it will resonate, and they'll go, okay, so knowing that, right? If I know that to be true, now what, right? How am I, with these ends in mind, how am I culturing this community to think about and work with? And then, of course, like anything, our technology does actually become a tool, right? So if I'm a grade 11, I don't know, history teacher, English teacher, right? And I know, right, that, for example, ChatGPT is going to help our students write the 5-paragraph essay may in fact be dead, right, from a learning perspective. But if I understand that, okay, now what are the learning ends in mind? How can I turn that? And now the children can still use the technology, but I'm putting them into a position where now they're still critically thinking. They're still living through what's the purpose of literature.
So that, well, and what's the purpose of writing, right? It forces us to ask these questions again. So how are you addressing this? Is it like, are you doing it at a district level? Is there a provincial group together? Like, I'm very curious as to how that's actually being done within the system.
Yeah. Well, we have a number of things at play. We have a Metro Vancouver consortium. So we're part of that with other school districts here. That's great. Different districts have invested more intensely in this, we've taken I believe we've are taking a very balanced and thoughtful approach in North Vancouver. So we do have a couple of we call them helping teachers at the district level that know the tools that are there, and they're workshopping and supporting teachers' understanding. I should step back. We did our very first workshop on this actually last year. This is how quickly this stuff changes. And we had a gentleman come and speak to us to really help people understand none of the tools, but what is generative technology, generative AI, understanding that sequencing. So again, building an understanding of what are we talking about here? It's not magic. Here's what it is. And so now, and again, we'll probably have to do a lot more of that, right? As baseline, it should be part of teacher education, like understand this and how it's designed.
Yeah.
Now, of course, with our helping teachers, they're doing sort of the hands-on stuff with teachers, and most teachers are looking at it now from their own planning perspective. So how are they using it? But we also have a district team, a diverse district team, and I've asked them to really, I've asked them to really think about pedagogy and what are the guiding beliefs. Like, have we truly thought about what do we believe about AI in relationship to teaching and learning? Because to me, I go back to, I guess this conversation it's so much about teachers having the time to think about that. And I believe that, again, most teachers are really good teachers. They care deeply about their work, their pros, and that when they contemplate and understand that, where does one understand AI, and then where might this fit with regards to my personal beliefs around pedagogy and then our shared beliefs. So to me, it's a evolving journey, and we're going to be on this for a few years.
Yeah, certainly going to be something that's going to take a lot of time. So maybe on that note, I've been part of, for many years, collaborations between the EdTech sector and the public sector. And I feel it's increasingly becoming more important given the rapid rate of, let's just say the growth of generative technologies, generative AI. What kind of purview do you have, or would you share with EdTech companies about how to build, how to develop, how to innovate in ways that are best suiting the needs of teachers and students?
Yeah, that's great. I think that there needs to be a greater genuine relationship between what is a good what does a good life look like, and what are we hoping to accomplish in education when our young people come out through grade 12, let's say, as a beginning. So I'd get away from this sales pitch notion, right? Like, we've got a product, we've built a product, and it's for you, and we're going to convince you that this product is
and
right.
it's a solution. It's going to solve things. It's going to solve things.
Versus let's work together, right? What does that look like if I'm a big company and I have the capacity to bring people together over a longer period of time to really work with us and work together on here are the problems that face humanity, right? And we want to create good people to live good lives. And you don't need to frame it even as problems, but here are the prevailing relationships that we need to help people, the human race, really excel at, have healthy relationships in. Now you're really into that landscape of, okay, if those are the ends in mind, then we consider development, right? So for kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, like, primary education is still primary education. Children need to learn certain things. And then you start breaking into intermediate when from a Piagetian notion, they're able to think differently. And then they get into 14, 15 years old. So attuning, right, technologies that really align from an educator's perspective towards those ends in mind and those relationships. Then I think you have, now that may not be expedient if I'm a company, I want to make money. But I think in the long game, that's how you really health. I always wonder about like BC, for example, the margins at the school district level are very slim, right? We don't have monies to invest the way I think we would like to. So from a BC perspective, I think it's in some respects some partnering with the Ministry of Education. However, right, I under the guise is there a compelling vision? I do think tech companies can, arguably really help promote what a healthy vision of, right? And again, be a part of in generating that conversation. And then I think you have more people going, okay, so how might the tools that you are developing really support this?
Can I put forward a thesis and you can
Sure.
agree with it, expand upon it, or tear it apart? I would suggest that given the rate of change and how difficult it is for districts and even ministries to keep up with that change, there has to be an internal renewal mechanism where there is some collaboration constant between the districts and the ministry in vetting, researching, and adopting new technologies.
I'd agree. However, I think the adoption of, right, whatever those tools are, need to be housed within a macro level agenda, right? So for example, if we're looking at relationship with the earth and you go into, for argument, synthetic biology as an appreciation of an underlying technological wave. Okay, if that's true, if that's a theme, so when we think of our higher level, some of our science, or even at younger levels, from grades 4 on up, what are some tools that are going to help teachers lean into those understandings and support the education of children, right? So I think it needs a level of organization where then you can have multiple operators in that space, right? But it's thematically organized. So people now have their choice of, well, I don't like this one, but I like this one, but it's still towards the end in mind.
Problem, and I don't know if there's a problem, but you're getting into a new BC curriculum now, right? But that's part of my point, is like, that's how fast, the themes, because I agree with you that we should be focusing on change, and maybe not the big themes like the ecological view, and you can take that ecological view, and as we've been discussing, apply it to tech and build a whole kind of pathway there. But what I see is these institutions that, for better or worse, are very slow in even conceiving of what to do, let alone implementing what to do.
It's very true. And then, and this is part where I go back to, tech companies who have the, intellectual horsepower is helping to frame the agenda, right? Like the agenda that I'm talking about, for argument's sake, these relationships, if we're really talking about human beings and the future of human beings on this planet, these are not strictly public schooling. These are for all of us, right? So it's probably, I'm probably speaking to how do we generate a narrative of what it means to be a human being in the time that we're in, and we all have a role in that. Now you create a greater spirit, right, in the time we're in, and I think that it can make sense to people. I think people are we're so inundated with bits and bytes that we collectively struggle. I mean, you look at the politics of today are probably an example of that, right? I'm not sure that, I look at some of the fragmentation there and the isolationist and the wanting to go back in time kind of versus actually this is a time when we need to be working even more so together. So it's a bigger phenomenon than just public schooling, I think.
Yeah, and so this is probably a good time to ask you to look forward into education and society into the future. And I don't know, I like the round number of 50 years because neither of us are going to be here. Then I guess we could be. We got to get lucky. But
I don't.
what does it look like to you?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, right? Of course, I am a reader. I try to, keep abreast with what people think out there. And I have to say, like, the thinking by some of really good thinkers, it's not very promising, right? With regards to where we are as a species, right? And some of the tensions, I think we're at a real interesting, point, right? I don't know. I think of Malcolm Gladwell and the tipping point notion, but we're at an interesting time when we look at the politics of the world and we look at some of the challenges that we face as to work together, right? And competing at individualism. So I'm worried about that. So in 50 years, it could be very, very scary in regards to where we are. I have to have hope, though. I do. On the flip side, my hope is, because of conversations like this and more of that notion of there needs to be some shared ways of thinking about how to go forward, that will have an influence. I do think we're at a time where, yes, there's changes, and changing a whole system is almost an impossible thing because of the complexity of it. But I do think that we need to try and contemplate what that difference would be.
Wonderful segue, my friend, into my penultimate question, which is, if you had a magic wand to change that system, however creatively Pius Ryan's brain can come up with it, how would you do that? What would you do? What would every classroom look like?
That's a great question. It's tricky, but number one, like, I would probably want to conceive every classroom. Like, let's really think about classrooms as communities. And so what do micro communities need in the time we're in? I think even in inner city schools, we need to contemplate, and I don't mean inner city by poor, I mean like just surrounded by buildings. I'm thinking, every classroom should be a nexus between indoors and outdoors. So even if we don't have a lot of greenery around, we create greenery around that space. So children and youth are able to explore and understand the natural world within the world we're in. So I would say any classroom should be a balanced community where teachers see their role, not just in the classroom, but also external to the classroom. So this is more of a composite of what it means to be a learner. I do think, if I had a magic wand, I do believe that some of these macro themes, they're part of schooling, but they're bigger than schooling, right? They're all of ours, right? And so these, can we not? I know it's always hard to get people to just agree, but here are the big themes that we all should be. And I know there's work that people are trying to do towards that end, but with those in mind, how do we provide structure, yet some flexibility for that school community, the school itself, within a community, to really have space and time to shape that and to talk about that, and for that to be a priority. And there's always ways to focus funding and resources to enable those conversations. And I guess that speaks to the higher level or the more macro level on how we bring a province or a country or even just the city of, say, North Vancouver together, is what are some of those mechanisms that really support that vision, right? Now, certainly I can see, back to those themes, I think they're that great learning community is being mindful of teaching about self and about other, right? In an intentional way. Like, it's not just, I'm a good person, so it happens. No, I'm intentionally teaching others about that. It is intentionally thinking about our relationship with the earth, the love of, and how that brings value, etc. It's intentionally mindful of where modern technologies fit in the evolution of our world. And I mean, modern technologies go into contemplation of how we have a a more circular-based economy and how they may lend value to that, etc. So that's where my mind goes to. I do think, when we talk about certain restrictions around collective agreements, like we're still arguing over class size and composition. Like which students can be in a
one
class.
of the things you would wish with the magic wand is everyone comes to a reasonable agreement.
Yeah, like, I mean, and I get it. There's pressures all around that, but that stuff is that distracts us into those conversations.
Yeah.
Right. Versus bigger ones.
Yeah. Like I come from a huge, like long line of pro-union family members, and they're I think they're necessary, but it's what's the modern kind of makeup of them in relation to leadership, in relation to all these fundamental questions you're asking. So I think that's a very excellent point to bring up. And
to design, right? Let's talk about how we support workers within a more modern design for.
Yeah, as opposed to this combative, like you get the most for your group, I get the most for my group, and that's always how we're going to approach it.
We're fighting about the structure that we have versus the structure that's possible.
Excellent way of framing that, and I actually hope that is more or less the theme of a future episode. But to wrap here, Pius, what book, podcast, movie, album have you enjoyed recently that you'd recommend to the audience? I know you got a whole bunch of good ones on tap.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's funny. I try to pick just bizarre stuff. I'm reading Life and Fate now by a Russian author in the late 50s.
That topic by a Russian, that sounds fantastic.
It's a beast. But I'm always intrigued by the human experience, right? So certainly one that influenced, there's a bunch that influenced me, but The Rise of the Network Society by Manuel Castells is quite a tome, but it's a very prescient. Now it's dated now, but it spoke to, if you read it, you go, wow, right? This person had a lens on the future.
Yeah.
I've just started to sort of read the book Nexus as, again, I find that thinking to be aligned. Margaret Wheatley's book, Who We Wish to Be, from an educator. Yeah, you have it there. Yeah, it's a good one. But Margaret Wheatley's book, it's a beautifully designed book, I think. I think it's called Who We Wish to Be. I think from an educator's perspective, it's a couple of years old now, but not that that's a bad thing. I find that to be a really a beautifully conceived book. Troubling at times, but beautifully conceived. I think it depends. I'm sorry, I'm long-winded on this because I think books are just so windows into, right? And so I try and look at the Pulitzer Prize winning books, and I just keep reading them because whether I like them or not, because there's intriguing notions in there of what it means to be human, right? I think that's the beautiful thing about literature is that, as I think you started in this conversation a little bit, who we are as human, our personal narratives and how we frame our experience and our view on the world. I'm a big fan of people. There are a lot of people who don't read, but I think everyone should try and read a little bit because it's an internal dialogue with yourself and it creates understanding.
Well, with that, Pius, I couldn't think of a better way to end this podcast. Thank you for your time.
Jason, it's been a pleasure. It was my first podcast, so it was kind of clunky getting started here, but it was
wonderful.
Well, I really appreciate biographies always intrigue me too, right? When people tell their story. And so I thank you for letting me share some of my thoughts. And I know that they're certainly not necessarily original, but I hope that you carry on with this conversation across our country. The more people that talk about what we want about education, we're far more likely to get closer to it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.